Recognizing the hazardous impact of industrial revolution on climate change, this House prefers that the world remained undeveloped compared to what the negating team is bringing in their world. If we continue on the path that the opposition is proposing, we will see detrimental impacts on the environment and society overall. We as a affirmative team define undeveloped under this topic as mass manufacturing is stopped and recycling will be highly significant for materials. Our model is that since we've recognized the detrimental impact that we've had on the environment and climate change, we would prefer the world to remain undeveloped. However, once climate change has been stopped to a significant degree, we can continue research into environmentally sustainable options. My point will be on climate change and the future, while my second speaker will go into benefits. It's extremely obvious that the diverse effects of our actions have led to increasingly worse climate change factors. We have seen multiple countries face large detrimental disasters, with the Solomon Islands facing flooding and typhoons while struggling to keep afloat. At the recent COP28 event, everyone internationally recognized the dire effects of climate change on almost every country. So far, set goals have not been reached or shown enough effect to rely on such options. Therefore, we, the affirmative, have proposed our model in place, since we've recognized the detrimental impact that we've had on the environment, and we would prefer the world to remain undeveloped. We are currently doing a trade-off where we give up developing the country for a certain period of time until things are stable, so it can prevent humanity from reaching its demise and turning into a dystopian world. We will start becoming more dependent on environmentally friendly options for transport and start relying on recycling and environmentally safe options. If there's a concern that it may be too sudden, take a look at the fact that it's only a couple more years until climate change is irreversible and we can't go back. But what is the opposition doing? Instead of stopping and trying to fix and prevent what will soon be upon us, they're instead encouraging us to continue and end humanity. And it's not just our generation that we should be worried about in this debate. What about the future generations? Living in a dystopian world just because the negating team's case has become reality isn't fair. Humanity will be pushed to the edge while climate change slowly creeps up upon us. However, we the affirmative, the proposition, are at least trying to prevent this from happening. We're trying our best for the generation and generations to come. Now, let's weigh both sides. Neg is arguing on the case that the world should continue developing, but at what cost? The fact that humanity may end itself, that natural resources may be depleted, and what do we, the affirmative, bring to the table? We bring a trade-off for a couple of years to stop climate change before continuing and being mindful to take care of the environment as well as bringing in other benefits, which is why I am proud to affirm. Thank you.
Under government side, we are going back to the time period of the 18th century where most of the countries such as the UK, France, and the US were underdeveloped and have not yet gone through the Industrial Revolution. Unless government can prove and illustrate a world where the Industrial Revolution did not exist, we think that the timeline we are going back to is a world with slavery, a world where people rely on agriculture and are more susceptible to things like droughts, flooding, or other natural disasters. Concepts such as technology, social media, vehicles, and a developed and working democratic or social system would not exist. These things rely largely on the advancements of the Industrial Revolution. The likely counterfactual relies on the majority of relying on agriculture, farming, and not having access to basic human infrastructure. Two responses before I move on to my substantive. Firstly, government side has a misunderstanding of what the motion is. We are not stopping all development in status quo from now. We are going back to the start of the Industrial Revolution because the motion clearly states that it prefers a world where they didn't have the Industrial Revolution, right? But even if this is even if Gov's world is the correct framing, this is still better for us because of the fact that stopping any development, this includes eco-friendly development in the status quo, without climate change means that we would not be able to do anything to stop climate change. Secondly, they cannot claim that they will develop in an environmentally sustainable way without causing some climate change. This is not fiated. But moreover, the motion clearly says a world that is not developed. They cannot claim that they would have any type of development or any type of information to know how to sustainably develop when we don't even know that in status quo. Eco-friendly development is still development and they're squirreling the motion. First argument is on how we are able to combat climate change. Firstly, climate change would still have existed either way. Natural disasters and other forms of climate change would still happen naturally, causing species to go extinct. This would happen regardless of humans and the Industrial Revolution. Secondly, note here that this is exclusive under our world and that we actually have the resources to invest in infrastructure that allows individuals to recover faster than just die from natural disasters. For example, in status quo, we have human support groups, helicopters, and media to help with people who are suffering with flooding disasters and raise awareness. We have things like earthquake-proof houses or house storages to combat food droughts and earthquakes. Second analysis here is that we have more social cohesion and backlash. Because of concepts like democracy, we are able to come together as a society and still fight for climate change, such as protesting or social movements. This wouldn't be able to happen without the Industrial Revolution, which has led us to democracy, as we have previously mentioned. We also have more global cohesion as well because the leaders of countries are able to communicate through social media or the technology developed in our world. Human resource support groups would not have existed in the government world. Even though we admit that climate change is worse in our world, this is largely mitigated. We're willing to take this trade-off because natural disasters still exist in government, and our side is able to effectively solve this. Because our side is able to solve problems such as poverty, have increased public safety, develop as a species, end slavery, and protect human rights. Our second argument here relies on the fact that the harms of being underdeveloped. The premise here is that the Industrial Revolution allowed for quick transport, democracy, public safety, and communication, which the other side do not have. Firstly, on democracy, it is hard to undergo the process of democracy without things like vehicles, technology, or other things that we rely on to get the votes to the capital would not be existed. That is visible in larger countries such as Russia, Canada, or the US that have larger land masses. The outcome here is that only the most privileged would be able to partake in democracy, and the lower class would not be able to protect their human rights, seen in instances of slavery and in other American countries, or the lower class often suffering from starvation. Second analysis here on public safety is that we will have less resources to help those who are affected by natural disasters because there are no measures against these disasters. Note that without medical advancements, which was a outcome of the Industrial Revolution, people would be more likely to be affected by plagues or other medical emergencies. This would not exist under Gov World, and that this means that though natural disasters are unlikely under Op World, they still exist, and therefore people who suffer from droughts, flooding, or wildfires would have little to no support and would die or be fatally harmed. Thirdly, on communication and support, global relations and trade would not exist. This means that it would be hard for any country to economically advance, and therefore the standard of life would be the same as it would have been in the 18th century. Communication would be difficult without technology or social media. Going back to public safety, this is things like a proper CJA system would not have existed without proper database, which means heinous crimes would go unsolved, and many people would rely on their local law support who do not have access to the proper technology. Proud to oppose.
In our modern world, our number one priority over anything and everything else is to keep it as it is. The longevity of our world would be preserved if we have the natural earth as it is, rather than if we had gone through like the Industrial Revolution, which had pumped trillions of tons of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere and contributed to global warming, where the temperature increases dramatically every single year. Honestly, who here would want to live in a dramatically gloomy world fast forward into the future on a rapidly rotting piece of land? And even then, suppose we have advanced so greatly that with our technology, we can now harvest our non-existent crops in record time. But what's the point even? All these technologies that mankind has developed rotates around one thing and one thing only, and that's the natural world. That is why we believe that recognizing the hazardous impact of Industrial Revolution on climate change, we much prefer that the world remain underdeveloped. Before I continue with our case, I would like to state a few pieces of rebuttal. So the opposition starts out by stating that we're going back to the 1800s, where most countries are underdeveloped, meaning that there will be many which were susceptible to slavery, drugs, and potentially racism. But our response to that, it's not even mildly related to our cases tonight, thus rendering it useless in their case. And they've also responded to our point that under their exclusive world, they have the technology to respond to fatally harmed individuals which were harmed as a result of what they have created, like climate change, global warming, which also lead to extra large, tsunamis, etc. So, but we believe that if we go back to our world, which is in the underdeveloped state, then such things won't ever or will rarely exist, and we would much rather than create technology. And now onto my substantive. So it's strongly evident in our world today that from climate change, global warming, and greenhouse gases down to the smallest change in nature or evolution in our world, this will soon become irreversible. Like a smoker's lungs, they're irreversible, and this is all due to the selfish compensation that an individual has made for something which was completely not worth it. Unlike our modern world, decaying, dying, it won't ever return back to its original form. However, consider that we never went through the Industrial Revolution, which was the number one reason behind all these harmful technologies we have formed. What would our world have been like? Obviously, it would have been more plentiful in natural resources, and thus we can fuel our needs using these resources, which are safe for the environment once we have made them. Thus, we believe that recognizing the hazardous impact of industrial revolution on climate change, we would much prefer for the world to remain underdeveloped.
Sure, we do agree that climate change is bad, but know that there are other problems and things, problems such as equality, democracy, slavery, capitalism, power imbalance, lack of infrastructure, patriarchy, sexism, and public safety that would be worse and underdeveloped under Gov's world. This is something that they need to engage with rather than simply passing it off as irrelevant. Before I move on to anything, a few responses. First of all, they keep coming back to the point that climate change is bad, but Rachel has already conceded that climate change is bad. However, there are harms such as lack of medical advancements, no proper CJS system, no proper democracy system, human resources, global cooperation, or any of the tens of mechanisms that Rachel has given you. But secondly, they deny our framing, they deny our likely framing of the motion. Though we agree that it is a bit vague, we think that the motion clearly states that they would prefer a world that remained underdeveloped, which means that this functions similarly to a regrets motion where we are starting from the industrial revolution of our world and coming back to the status quo. But thirdly, there has already been progress to prevent climate change from happening. Gov comes into this debate with this weird framing that they're changing what has happened already, but note that this debate happens from the beginning of time. So their world is a world where they simply stopped developing before the Industrial Revolution. So under our world, we still have things such as the continued development of renewable energy from companies that realize that we will die soon. Humanity doesn't want to cease to exist, and governments and companies in the status quo are realizing that climate change is important. And as we can see, international change is happening. Note that under their world, you don't have the development of renewable energy. So sure, you decrease climate change, but our world isn't completely hopeless. We are making progress, and climate change is something that we can turn back from. We already weigh this and tell you that there are other important issues in this debate. So now my extension regarding individual fulfillment of life. And the premise here is that individuals are able to have a much more fulfilling life under our world without having to worry about survival. Two main layers of mechanism here. First of all, social equality would not have been developed as much under Gov. Before the Industrial Revolution, note that things such as slavery still existed and there was a lack of universal human rights. Organizations such as the UN did not exist in the first place. Note that the development of social equality cannot happen under Gov without the Industrial Revolution because people still primarily rely on manual labor such as farming. So one, people are still busy making a living, so they're unlikely to want to care for or advocate about these issues. But two, power imbalances are further worsened under Gov because capitalism was the most recent attempt in order to liberate individuals and the most progress that has been made, whereas Gov's world is where democracy is less widespread and you have a larger lower class because you don't have things such as more accessible infrastructure in order for people not only rely on the ultra rich. So under your world, even without the Industrial Revolution, you would still have the ultra rich exploiting off of everyone else on the ground, and climate change would still happen to some extent. The conclusion here is that at least under our world, we already have basic human rights and welfare developed in most countries, and progress is being made in developing countries so that people can live a fairly fulfilling life. But secondly, note that leisure time is necessary in order for people to live fulfilling lives. Humans are the only conscious beings that are actually aware of their existence, so they need to have a meaning in order to live. Under our world, at least we have time instead of being consumed by trying to make a living in order to explore your other passions. Three main impacts here. So although equality is not perfect under our world, we allow for institutional support in attempt for equality. So we have already made a lot of progress with things such as democracy. This is necessary in order for society to progress without leaving a large group of minorities behind. But secondly, they weigh this and say that, oh, we need to turn back from climate change. This is important. But we tell you that we have this developed in order to, and so now we actually have time to look back into things such as climate change and turn back from it. For example, as I already tell you, companies are incentivized now because climate change, because being environmentally friendly is something that they want to opt into in order for a better image. So we're the ones who actually develop things such as better technology. So now let me do some weighing here. This argument is important because individuals always want to live a fulfilling life, and this is something that is important in order to not want to die. Humans are the only creatures on Earth that are aware of our consciousness. Therefore, this is exclusively important for us to live a life that is worth living, rather than simply surviving because we are exclusively conscious. The comparative under Gov is that the majority of individuals are still stuck worrying about whether they will survive or not. This is a dangerous narrative because it is only under our world that people actually have made things such as universal human rights and basic morality, because people no longer have to worry as much about putting food on your table.
The
So
opposition is living in a world in which ecosystems are failing. People struggle to feed themselves as the world overpopulates. Agriculture is flailing and starvation and famines are rampant, with environmental mayhem ravaging our world. Natural resources are rapidly diminishing, detrimentally affecting the whole of the world's population. If we continue to mass produce and manufacture things with no limits, our world will become a planet of misery and death. As we continue to set new limits for sky-high temperatures and continue to push this planet to its brink, we are paving the way for our descendants to die as the result of our greedy actions. To leave this world undeveloped would preserve Earth for future generations and prevent billions of people dying. Our ecosystems would remain intact and begin to flourish and thrive as they did hundreds of years ago. Humanity would be guaranteed to live and continue on, despite the lack of certain products. This trade-off would benefit this world and the whole of society through its sustainability. Onto my rebuttal. In today's debate, I have found two themes. The first theme is what both our worlds will look like. The second theme is whether or not compensating like our certain technology today for the natural world is worth it. Onto the first theme. We see the opposition come out and say that we will be going back to the start of the Industrial Revolution, with the world more susceptible to natural disasters as they increase. They also said that our world will essentially spiral into a decline of slavery and lack of medicine and lack of food as democracy fails. This is false for two reasons. The first reason is that our model clearly states that we will leave our world as is, not getting rid of the world's current technology. We will not be going back prior to the Industrial Revolution, and technological advancements or tools or weapons that can prevent climate change will continue to be researched and developed. The second reason is that no, society will not fall into a bottomless pit of slavery and lack of medicine and flailing democracy simply because we stop mass manufacturing Toyotas or Hyundais or iPhone 15s and relied more on public transport and have the incentive to save future generations. Natural disasters will only become more common in their world as temperatures rise and the climate becomes unsteady and unstable, becoming much more difficult to predict, meaning that they will claim more lives and be more dangerous. The opposition team's claims have not been backed up. If anyone has a POI, I would be happy to take it now. Onto the second theme. The opposition then states that, onto the second theme, which is whether or not compensating all our certain technology today for the natural world is worth it. It is clearly worth it, and this is true for two reasons. The first reason is that the opposition clearly believes that slavery, basic human rights, and a world which may be potentially ruled by Bolsheviks is more important than the dooming year 2050, which will certainly lead to the demise of the natural world and its inhabitants as we know it. Additionally, as we have stated before in our second speaker's case, our number one priority is to keep the natural world as it is. Why? Why would we want to do this? Would the opposition want to remain in this world where we are clearly and irreversibly rotting and dying away? Is it because they want basic human rights? Is it because they would like to prevent possible slavery as a result of this? Or is it because they really want new computers? Maybe maybe, but in the case today, they are on the greedy stance of wanting technology and our rotting world over the original natural world, which will prevent billions of people from dying. The second reason is that the opposition believes that in our world, there is no development of environmentally friendly resources. However, we have mentioned that preventing climate change from worsening is our top priority, due to the fact that if we just ignore the elephant in the room, humanity will end. And no, we aren't saying that there is no development of sources, but in our model, that there is no development of resources, but in our model that you should have been able to listen to, we have repeatedly stated that we will continue developing such sources and resources after preventing and fixing the current largest detrimental issue, which is the world. To prevent the demise of this entire world and its residents, and the horrific suffering that will be undergone by future generations due to our hesitance to trade off some items in exchange for survival, it is essential that this world remains undeveloped. Hence, I am proud to
Just
affirm.
asserting the harms of climate change is not enough for side government to win this debate. To actually prove their burden, they have to successfully weigh how climate change is more harmful than the harms of being underdeveloped, such as not having a democracy, having slavery, human rights abuses, more poverty, and other numerous harms that our previous speakers have said but have been largely unresponded to. I'll move on straight into my responses. Government likes to think that the motion is only that factories or things like gasoline-powered cars would disappear and would be replaced by eco-friendly vehicles, etc. However, this is not possible because for electric cars to have been developed, you first need to go through the mechanism of developing a cheaper, easier to make gasoline-powered car, then turn to the more environmentally friendly option. It is impossible for us to just return to before the Industrial Revolution and start having all of the technology and all of the advancements to be able to suddenly change into a completely eco-friendly, high-tech world. This is done exclusively on our side, like Ayn tells you. Secondly, they also claim that people still struggle to live in our world. However, we think that even though this is true, their world will be comparatively worse. We agree that there are flaws in the status quo, but that doesn't justify turning back to the beginning of time just because of climate change, especially because of, again, all the harms that we've mentioned. And finally, Gov continues to reject our framing that their world is leaving the world as it is. But the motion literally states that they regret the Industrial Revolution and that they would not be able to develop, since the motion clearly says this house regrets like a developed world, basically. But sure, let's agree that this framing is true. Then why do we still win this debate? This is because our world is the status quo where the development to avoid climate change is still happening. Note that you cannot prevent climate change from happening when there are people on the ground struggling from poverty and ultra-rich simply saying that they would change the environment under Gov's world. But even at best, this is a wash. If they say that climate change is so bad and that our world will end in this demise and literally as their whip says irreversibly, then why would you be able to change? There was no mechanism proving why they would be able to change the environment. And now I'll move on to our first main class, which is can side government actually be able to make climate change better? So they're claiming that climate change has caused, firstly, a lot of environmental harm. We have like two layers of analysis to respond to this point. Firstly, climate change and other disasters would still naturally happen on their side, regardless of things like human development or influence. In fact, it would be even more harmful because of the fact that it takes development to develop things, like buildings that are earthquake resistant, like tornado warnings. So even if a lack of human-caused climate change could lead to less natural disasters, it is undeniable that when they do happen, which they would, the effects would be exacerbated and comparatively worse than our side, since there wouldn't be any adaptations. Our first speaker has already mentioned this. However, we largely didn't get any response from side government, so you can assume that this point stands and that side government does concede that their side does not have any ways to help the most vulnerable victims of natural disasters. But secondly, we also have ways to help solve climate change and mitigate the harms directly. Since we wouldn't have the same level of societal cohesion, especially since we wouldn't even have effective ways of traveling long distances or social media to spread awareness of issues to a diverse audience, we can still have people criticizing and having backlash to the corporations and governments who are actively the biggest polluters, which is mutually exclusive. We can currently see this happening in our status quo, such as technology that can clean water pollution and actively reverse harms of climate change. Now move on to our second class, which is climate change more important than like development and everything else? We've already explained so many harms of not having this developed society from all of our previous speakers. So what do these look like? Firstly, we would not be able to have concepts such as even democracy or equality, since it is extremely hard to like actually create democracy without having things like vehicles, technology, social media, or other ways to communicate that we can rely on to get votes to the capital or like to count all of these votes that would not exist on side government. This is very visible in especially larger countries that look like Russia, Canada, or the US that have objectively larger land masses. The biggest communities that they would be able to have on their side are like one family, which obviously wouldn't be able to do much or be able to develop much. The outcome here is that only the most like privileged or a few people would actually be able to partake in this, instead of it being completely acceptable to all that we can do. And so we think that they just failed to win this debate as a whole, because even though they're asserting a bunch of harms of like climate change, we still don't think that that's enough to outweigh the fact that firstly, climate change would still exist on their side, and secondly, they would just not having a developed society, which means that all of the harms that our side has proved would be true. Thank you.
We win this debate because the opposition never responds to our likely characterization while we respond to their likely counterfactual. We win this debate because our likely counterfactual in the motion stands due to logic and all of our mechanisms go unanswered. Firstly, let's talk about how this motion works. Govs likes to think that the motion is that only factories, things like gasoline powered cars would disappear and would suddenly be replaced by eco-friendly vehicles, democracy, universal human rights would still exist, and they assume their best case. But Lauren already tells you that this is not true. Ayn already tells you this is not true. I've already told you this is not true, and this never goes response to. They contradict themselves to say that their world would prefer a world where the Industrial Revolution, in their two first speakers, then their whip contradicts that and states that their side will stay the same as status quo, but they will just stop all carbon emissions from happening. Let's take this latter characterization. With many jobs suddenly destroyed because factories are being discontinued, with nuclear factories being obliterated and left to their own devices, many cars, technology, and social media just be taken away, humans would have to deal with mass amounts of pollution and natural disasters without any technology to help them. Their side is not able to solve climate change because they can't just all stop it at the same time without having any development. Not having development doesn't just mean not having gasoline-powered cars. It means there wouldn't be any development at all, and instead government refuses to accept their burden, squirreling around it whenever they can. The other counterfactual is that we give you, and we thought they already took it, like as I was starting again from the timeline where the Industrial Revolution did not happen. I would like to talk about how inconsistent their case is again, but the more important thing here is that technology, human support, democracy, discrimination, social justice systems, healthcare systems, and almost everything that we tell you from my speech would not happen under government's world. We acknowledge the fact that we may have given our opponents a little bit too much to rebut against, but none of our mechanisms went responded to at all. And the most built ideas about support against climate change, democracy, and lower SES classes being most impacted, the main ideas that Ayan has talked about, stand strongest in this debate. Things like vehicles and medicines being linked to the Industrial Revolution is incredibly intuitive, but the impact we end up with is a world that is not linked or developed. Let's talk about how OP does not develop or engage to anything within our speeches, giving us the same intro of how climate change is bad when we have conceded to this in my first speech and throughout all of our speakers. We think that it is unfair for government to continuously state that they prevent climate change when we already proved to you how our world has measures to turn back from climate change, such as the development of renewable energy, which they don't have. Government responds to this and says that their world also somehow has this, but we tell you that this debate happens under their world where all this development has not happened. But if we do concede this, we already tell you that this is a wash at best, because things such as renewable energy and development happens under our world too. All of our speeches were so generous and assume the best case of govs in our responses, so we still win this debate.
This house would rather that the Earth stayed undeveloped and at the current stage than what the opposing team is bringing into this planet, despite acknowledging the dangerous effects of Industrial Revolution on climate change. The environment and society at large will suffer if we follow the course that the opposition is advocating to us. Under this theme, we described undeveloped as the stop of mass manufacturing and the importance of recycling for materials. In this debate, I have identified one recurring issue in this debate, being, does this actually benefit the environment and which side brings more to the table? The neg begins by saying, well, no, by stopping what you've mentioned, you're going to spiral into slavery and lack of medicine, and your world will have no human rights. We, the affirmative, have stated that this clearly isn't true. We won't go into slavery or end just because Toyotas and little plastic trinkets will stop being manufactured, but humanity will end at the rate you guys are going in your world and the detrimental case. I would now like to move on to why we win. Firstly, we don't clearly understand or see how our world right now, with clear views on justice, behavior, and manners, as well as views, will suddenly spiral into the depths of the disaster just because cars and toys have been stopped being mass-produced and toxic fumes have been stopped. This has been repeatedly stated for our entire case. Now, let's take the negating case at its best. Even if everything works, 2050 is a year that looms over us, signaling when climate change will be irreversible. Sure, there's still issues in our worlds, but in their world, they're just driving to their impending doom. Weigh both sides, and you'll realize that while negative case is centered around us failing in our world, at least we're trying to make an effort. They also mentioned that we contradict ourselves by saying we won't go back before the Industrial Revolution. However, when did we mention that we would actually go back? The topic mentions that we would prefer to go back, but we really can't, because just by throwing away all our machinery and subsistence that we've made into open nature is worse than what we've proposed as the affirmative team. They also mentioned that we have not engaged through their speeches. However, we would like to point out on multiple times that at the start, they have been clearly ignorant of our stated model multiple times. They also mentioned people being affected by such natural disasters. However, at least we're trying to end this. What are you doing in your world? We haven't heard any evidence that what you're trying to do, something on your side, actually works. We haven't heard a lot of clear evidence. Instead, you've spent most of your time rebutting us, and we thank you for that. And finally, why we win. Our proof of burdens are the following, as we have stated clearly before. Firstly, we need to prove that the natural world as it is will be more important than keeping the technology we have today, and while we will eventually return to that after a short period. How we have responded to this is by bringing on the fact that it is infinitely more important to keep our natural world and then develop technologies around that, rather than have a rotten core and make technology around that. Like an apple, you have to start from the inside to outside. You cannot take off the skin and just reverse the core inside out. The opposition tries to convince the room that it's virtually impossible to create our simple world in which nature is normal and protected, and create technology around that. They try to bring your attention to other frivolous matters such as human right or voting. Will that really matter in 2050 when the world is driving itself to its end and humanity will end? First, we believe in our world, we keep the most benefits that are long-term, and this is why I am proud to affirm. Thank you.